It's May 23rd, 2014. This is an interview with Jose Villa. Hello, Jose.
Howdy.
Jose, tell us about your personal background, your parents, where you were born, your siblings.
Well, I was number 12 in a family of 15. My parents came from the Mexican Revolution in 1915, and my father was involved in that revolution. I don't know of any Mexicans that weren't, but he had to come to this country because they were looking, los federales were looking for him to kill him or put him in prison or whatever they did. He used to go to campos de batalla and collect the Mauser rifles and pistols and bayonets, whatever he could find, and collected them and then would sell them. That's how he helped support his little poor family in the Haciendita, Mexico, which is not far from Ocampo and Nuevo León in central Mexico.
And he came to where?
He came to Clovis, New Mexico. He and my mom had 2 older children, but he brought with him his widowed sister, older sister, who had 2 children, and his parents and his younger brother, because they had killed his brother-in-law, Tia Damiana's husband, whose name was Galicia, because they wouldn't tell them where my dad was hiding out. And so if you don't tell us, we'll kill one of you. So they took my Tia Damiana's husband and put him up on the wall and shot him. And so when my father heard that, he said, vámonos. ¿A dónde? Pues para el norte, up north. So that's how they came. And there are a lot of stories that if people are interested in understanding that whole process, they should read Victor Villaseñor's book on Rain of Gold, because that's the story of the Mexicans that came not only to California, but my parents that went to Clovis, New Mexico. And the tales they tell there are things I heard in my house when I was a little boy, and it was hard to believe. And when I read Rain of Gold, and I said, my goodness, somebody else went through this. I literally cried because I thought my dad was just telling stories, not really telling the real history. But it was true. They went through hell to try and make their way in a new land. My parents never went to school because they were in a very poor rural area. They had nothing like that. They never learned English. But every year they signed up as foreign aliens, and I had copies of that, the little slip that they used to sign. So all I have to say is I had 2 older brothers born in Mexico, and the only other thing, and we struggled. We were migrants in the Texas Panhandle area, and pulling cotton, picking cotton, escardas, pulling broom corn, and all the things that migrants did around there. So I learned what a long, hard day's work was.
What was your mother like?
My mother was, of course, to me, a beautiful woman. She may have seemed homely to some people, but she was beautiful. And I was very close to her. She taught me all the prayers I know. And she taught me how to pray the rosary. And then I had 3 older brothers that were in World War II, in active combat. And so my mom used to worry very much about them. So she used to pray, start the Santo Rosario, and she'd get so emotionally wrought that she couldn't finish. She started weeping. And I would finish the rosary for her. So I saw what the war did to my mom and to some of us. And in our neighborhood, two of our neighbors' children were killed in the Normandy landing. And I heard all this crying and all this emotional reaction to what happened. And it was heartbreaking, but that's the other thing I remember I was born in 1931, and this was 1941, and later in 45 when the war ended. And I've got a lot of things to say, but I want to focus on the fact that my mother was a woman of great faith, and so was my father, but in a different way.
What were their names?
Encarnación Ortiz Villa, and my mother was María de la Luz Díaz de León Villa.
And was she from Mexico also?
Oh yes, she came up with my father.
Okay. I'm sorry, you were talking about their faith.
Well, like I said, she He used to take us to church, dress us up on Sunday with our patched up pecheras and slick down hair and whatever. But I noticed my dad didn't always go to church. And so as a little 6-year-old boy, I had the temerity to say to my father, ¿Y usted por qué no va a la iglesia? And instead of saying, cállate el hocico and dándome un revés, he said something strange to me. And what he said was, Hijito, la vida es la religión. And what's a 5-year-old supposed to do with that, you know? And while I was trying to process about what are these words, why did he say that? He added something else. And the something else he added was, y cada persona que es parte de tu vida es parte de tu religión. So at a very young age, I started thinking about things that my parents said, prayers that they prayed, their grit in being able to manage the discrimination I saw in Texas about my dad not being able to go to the front door but to the back door to ask for food, hamburgers, hot dogs, whatever we could eat. And also it was before the civil rights, and I remember going to a water fountain, and there was colored water fountain and then there was white. And I looked at my hands and they're brown, so I colored. That's what I did. I went to the black fountain, which was white. But anyhow, I learned at a very young age about racism, discrimination, and many other things that happened to us.
What was Clovis, New Mexico like when you were a child growing up?
It was a smaller town at the time of about maybe 8,000-9,000 people. But there was a barrio. That was where all the Mexican people lived together, you know, in Guadalupe Church. And that's where all the Mexicans went. And Sacred Heart Church was over there away from us, and that's where all the white folks went. And that's the way it was. And I was the first Mexican to marry the first gringa from Sacred Heart in Guadalupe. And of course, there was a lot of reactions on both sides to that. So what Claire and I did is that we just said, to hell with us and got the hell out of there. But it was not good. I mean, Clovis is 9 miles from the Texas border. And Susie Wilson, who used to be on city council and later a supervisor, I used to see Susie and I'd say to you, Susie, you damn Texan, how the hell are you? And she would say to me, oh, Jose, why do you call me a damn Texan? And I would say to her, because I'm from Clovis, New Mexico, and it's 9 miles from the damn Texas border, and I had to come to California to find out that damn Texas is 2 words. So I used to josh her that way, but that does paint a picture of the influence Texans had on eastern New Mexico. And it's still kind of, you know, that way, you know, those Texans that still look at those Mexicans as good field hands and things like that. But I'm saying that because I remember very clearly 1941 when they took there was a Japanese guy, there was a little Japanese village by the Hielera, by the railroad, who worked on the railroad, and they had cherry trees. And I had my tío Fidel, who married my tia that I talked about, Galicia, worked at the Hielera. And so my cousin Greg used to take us to pick cherries from the cherry trees that the Japanese people grew. We got to be friends with them, buddies. And so one of them married a Chicana that lived just down the street from us in the corner. But one day they were gone. And it was because he got hauled away to go to a concentration camp. And so did all the people in that little Japanese village. So I learned about discrimination in more than one way, and about the war and what dark art can do in terms of concentration camps and things like that. So those were life lessons that I think made me think how I could be of service and help to the Chicano community, but also to other minority communities. So I grew up with a very ecumenical attitude about how do I work with any group of people that's oppressed. And I think that's something that I've never forgotten, and it served me well when I came to San Jose especially, and also in Phoenix, Arizona, where I worked before coming here.
Before we talk about your Phoenix, Arizona and coming here, tell me about your education from elementary school to as far as you went.
When my mom died, to whom I was very close, 1945, my pastor, Father Conradin Stark, he was one of my first heroes outside of my family. He somehow got my dad to agree to have him send me to the seminary, to the it was German Franciscans in Cincinnati, Ohio.
At what age?
At age, I was 13 when my mom died, but I turned 14 when I went to the seminary. So I was pretty young. But before that, regarding education, something that sort of developed in me an attitude that I could accomplish and take advantage of any opportunity was that my older brother, John, was a musician, a violinist, and he was headed toward concert type of musicianship, but he injured his hand, his key hand, the left hand, and he became a music teacher. But I was number 12, and I was what they called at that time un tísico, very sickly, scrawny little kid. I'm the littlest in my whole family. And so he convinced my parents, and my mother in particular, to have him take me to college with him in Las Vegas, New Mexico, at age 8. So at age 8, my brother John took me to be with him, and he was living a college life. And so he was a musician, and I'd go and to his practices, and he was in the band, marching band, and I was around following him all over the place. And so I got introduced to campus life at a very young age because of my brother. And he fed me fruits and vegetables, and it wasn't just beans and tortillas like we had at home, you know. But when I went to the seminary, I missed my beans and tortillas. But that's where I learned to like sauerkraut and kartoffelklation, German ways of cooking roasts, and applesauce, and they even fed us beer on St. Francis Day because they were German Franciscans. They drink beer. So it was a totally different cultural experience, like night and day. And so I survived in that milieu, and it introduced me to a whole new way of life. From what I had been used to, large family, small adobe house, no facilities, no electricity, no plumbing, outhouse, and things like that. So it was like night and day. So when people ask me, what is it like? I said, it's like this movie, not The Hobbit, but the thing the kids like, that they talk a lot about.
Harry Potter?
Potter. And they go into, when they have this scene when they first go into this big hall with all the tables lined up, and at the end there's a big table with all of the wizards. Well, I walked into that seminary with about 200 kids, mostly white. I was only one of like 3 Latino Chicanos, And they were brown-robed with their cowls. And it was like in Harry Potter, it was a hall, the wizards, Gee whiz, and a little adobe house to these big hallways, polished floors, and Gothic chapel, and it was a total new life experience.
So again, you went at age 14, so what year was that, and how long were you there?
1945 to 1940, I was there 3 years. In 1948, I returned home because my dad had a stroke, and I had 2 younger brothers living at home. And I had to leave the seminary and return to help take care of my father and my brothers. And I finished high school at a small Catholic high school there in Clovis, where I met Claire, my wife. Mm-hmm. And so we were high school friends.
What was the name of the high school?
Sacred Heart High School. And I graduated with a group of 12 people. And she was in a group of 10 people when she graduated. So it's a small, compact Catholic high school. We had sisters of St. Casimir, who were Lithuanian sisters, And they taught us Lithuanian and we would teach them Spanish. So I know a few phrases in Lithuanian because of that. And then I learned German. And so at a very young age too, and with those experiences, I learned to appreciate foreign languages, besides speaking a foreign language, which was Spanish. And my mother, I have to say this about my mother, like Ernesto Galarza's mother taught him how to read out of a cookbook. Well, my mother had one of our comadres could read and write, teach her so she could communicate with her relatives in Mexico, because all of my relatives on my mother's side stayed in Mexico. And I just recently made contact with a first cousin, and I've never met any of them, and I've had to go meet this first cousin personally because she lives in Dallas, Texas now. And she has brothers and sisters in Aguascalientes and Zacatecas and those areas. So I'd like my next bucket list, if I hold up health-wise, is to go and meet some of my mom's family.
Going back to your schooling.
Oh, let me say this.
Go ahead.
My mother was taught to read and write from the only book in our house, which was La Sagrada Biblia, the Holy Bible. So my mom, her comadre would say, estas palabras, blah, 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 made her literate. And then she would practice reading to us from the Holy Bible. And that's where I learned about Joseph, and that's where I learned about, my name is Jose Joseph, and I dream a lot. And I was number 12 in my family, but I did not have a coat of many colors. I did not. I do now. But, and it's a sarape. So anyhow, my young life helped to mold me literally into being not only ecumenical, but tolerant of other people and willing to help anybody in need. And I think that led to my wanting to be a social worker that I didn't know at the time, but that's why I mean, later on you might say, well, why did you become a social worker? Well, there's a lot of reason for it.
Tell me, what kind of a student were you in elementary, middle school, and high school? How would you be described?
I think I was like an A-B student, B+. I was one of in those days, in esos días, I was one of the persons that started to learn English when I started school, because Spanish is all we need. And so I know what it's like to go into a setting, y hablan inglés, what did she say? Because our grades were put together, and because it was a small Catholic school too. And so we would ask somebody that already knew, what is she saying, So we interpreted for each other. And then we started learning, what certain words were and so forth and so on. It's because we did have a kindergarten, but then we were out in the fields, so we would, vamos a la pizca de algodón, and that lasted through September, October, and sometimes we missed a lot of school. And so we were a little behind when we got into school, when we were enrolled. And it's the same story of big Mexican families. We all had to pitch in and help bring in a few reales to survive. But I was always very interested to learn, and we used to tease my parents because they didn't know English, but some of us were serious about telling them, esta palabra significa tal y cual, So we became teachers of our parents and learning English too, but they didn't ever really learn much English.
What were your favorite subjects?
From what I can remember, of course, in school I was intrigued, in elementary school. I was intrigued what something they used to teach us about, and it was the lives of the saints. And of course, some of those stories were unbelievable about what made them saints. And that intrigued me, like, ¿cómo es posible? How is that possible, And the whole question later on, teenage years, about, well, if God is God, why doesn't He help us get out of this quagmire we find ourselves in, sort of questioning? And you go through that whole introspective of, why isn't God helping me more? And things like that. But my mother was of great faith, as I said, and my father gave us a good grounding. My father was a Mexican Indian, and my older brothers always reminded me, no se les olviden que su papá era 100% indio. ¿Qué tribu? Maya, no sé qué. Well, later on I'll tell you about, well, Hector Garcia was an anthropologist from Mexico. He told me, Otomí eran los que vivían cerca de Guanajuato, where my parents came from. But anyhow, to stick to those early experiences, my mother also did something very much that got me prepared for coming to San Jose. And that was, she always went about her kitchen work or sweeping or anything, always singing Mexican corridos or Mexican songs. And my two older sisters used to harmonize. They used to sing some of the songs, current songs included, of the 40s and 50s. And so singing was a very big part of our family. My brother, as I said, was a musician. My older brother, Jesus, was a musician. My brother, Gilberto, was a musician. And they all used to get together and go at it, and have a fiesta without having to need an excuse for having a fiesta and drinking beer. My dad used to make homebrew, too. So we used to have a good time that way. But we had, we were very poor. I was just telling Corazon's current husband, who's a retired financier and all that sort of thing, lives in San Carlos, Republican, and he doesn't understand this whole entitlement stuff about welfare. And so I said, well, think of entitlementality. That's what you have, entitlementality about the poor people. He says, but I think about the privileged whites who are also taking advantage of entitlements. Corporations that have freeways built by the government, etc. So we had an interesting discussion. So the point is that at an early age, I really learned about social justice by hearing about the lives of the saints, Jesus, how he lived and what he sacrificed. So later on, when I read Viktor Frankl's book on Man's Search for Meaning, there was one sentence I took away from that book. And that sentence was, pain and suffering can be sustained so long as you understand the sacrifice involved. And that helped me understand the sacrifice of the cross. And here's a Jewish person, psychiatrist, who wrote a book about how pain and suffering, the Holocaust played into the Jewish people, and Hitler and all that. But I take these things, and I'm saying this to you now because later on I'll talk about San Jose State and what made me carry out my job responsibilities. But I want to say that from Clovis, I had another experience I talked to Dr. Galardes about in an apologetic way. Out of the Air Force, my first job was I became part of a management training program for ASCS services, Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Services. So I went for training in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and Lovington, New Mexico, and here we are again, Eastern New Mexico. And because I had that training, I applied for a job in Portales, New Mexico, for manager of the ASCS office there. And I was one of the two finalists. And so 3 tall Texans that interviewed us called us to let us know about their decision. And they said to me, Joe, we like you. You're highly qualified. You're very well qualified training program. And you've been working with farmers at Carlsbad and Lovington, but we can't hire you. I says, why not? Just because you're a Mexican. Just like that. We can't hire you because you're a Mexican. In Portales, New Mexico, by 3 Texans that had big ranches, farms. So that's my first experience with overt racism, My second experience in organizing sort of way was that when I went to Lovington to let my manager there know, he was a real nice guy, I just called him Paul Peterson, Mo Peterson, I was board and care with him. And They were decent folks, even though they were also Texans, but they were decent. They were Methodists. And I learned that the first Friday I was there, and she fed us fried chicken. And I didn't eat it because at that time we couldn't eat meat on Fridays. And so I told her why. I said, Mom Peterson, I can't eat this because I'm a Catholic. And the next Friday we had fish. And I said, well, you guys don't have to stop eating chicken just because I'm Catholic. Her only words were, Joe, the good book says, eat the bread of thy brother. And that's where I again learned how a Catholic can relate to Methodists, and Protestants in terms of how do we mitigate differences. Those experiences, and then my organizing experience after that, I was hired by the Lee County Farm and Livestock Bureau in Lovington, New Mexico. Because again, Texas farmers mostly wanted to hire me because I had something valuable. They needed Spanish to go contract braceros. So I became the manager of Lee County Farm and Livestock to contract braceros mostly, and then supervise how they were doing along with the federal field representatives of the Labor Department. And I learned a lot about politics because it was Severano Trujillo who had been a secretary to Senator Cutting, I think, Cutting? Or Chavez. But anyhow, he and I got into discussions about la política de Nuevo Mexico, and that is another kind of politics. But I started learning about how politics works in those levels, in that game. And one day, a group of Mexicanos, a farmer came in to complain to me that the Mexicans would not pick cotton. So I had to go out and tell them they had to pick cotton. But then when he told me why they were not picking cotton, they showed me their hands. Los capullos were verdes. They were green cotton hulls that would tear their fingertips. So they could not pick the cotton very well. And the contract distinctly states, the contract between the U.S., the braceros were not to be forced to pick cotton if he wasn't ready for picking. So I told him, when, espérense aquí, siéntense. And the farmer said, what did you tell him? I told him to sit down because I'm going to go get the U.S. field representatives. What are you going to do that for? He says, I want him to explain their rights to them. And he says, well, I think it's a mistake. He says, I have to do it, or else you and I are going to get in deep trouble. So I went and got Severano Trujillo. He came, he heard the story, and he says, no, he explained to the farmer, you can't make him pick up. That's the law. And so he got pissed as hell at me, of course, and tried to fire me and all that, but that was the first strike I organized. Mexicanos, sit down strike. And I didn't especially know what I was doing, but I did it. Later on, I reflected on it. Well, there are ways to use the system, as Alinsky says, make the man live up to his rules. And that's exactly what I had done. But I had never read Alinsky, but anyhow, I experienced some early on things about organizing, including how I saw how we, my family, were organized to go and work, and we lived in Clovis, but we had to go and work in Texas. And that whole thing is another story, but all I'm saying is that I learned how to relate to the Mexican people, the Mexican workers, and field workers, which then was important in the work I did in Phoenix and San Jose.
So, why don't you tell me about the work you were doing just before you came to San Jose and why you decided to come here?
That's another interesting story because Phoenix, Arizona, of all places, which was Goldwater territory, and people should know about Goldwater, ultra-conservative guy that ran for president, and John Rhodes and other people. I don't think John McCain was there yet, but he may have been, I don't know, as a young dude. But I do know that conservative Republican territory. Well, I was hired out of getting my degree on my GI Bill from UNM, from the School of Inter-American Affairs, which means I studied the history, the language, the geography, and the economics of Latin America. So I brought that knowledge I mean, I gained my degree by not only going on my GI Bill, but working. And I wound up working full-time, taking 18 units, going all the time, and raising a family. So when I started college on my GI Bill, Claire and I were waiting for our first child. But when I finished my degree, we had 4 kids already. We had 4 kids. We have 8 children, and 4 were born in New Mexico, and 4 were born in Arizona. So 2 of them in Yuma, Arizona, where I went because the work I had all the time I was going to UNM was as a recreation supervisor. Later I was the founding director in the recreation center where it was mostly Mexican people and black people. So at that experience was again working with minorities and then organizing parents to help us in getting resources for the kids, which worked out very well. So that I did have organizing experience, although again, I was still not a social worker in a social work program or an organizer. But I was doing it. And I took that experience to Yuma, Arizona, and then I really learned how to organize senior citizens, the snowbirds, people from northern areas that came to Yuma and Arizona for the winter. And I learned to work with senior citizens who represented all kinds of different ethnic groups, etc. From most of them none of them were Mexican. They were all gringos, snowbirds that came from up north. But I learned a lot of things from them, and I was always that way. I always was learning why people were different, and I taught them Spanish. And I taught them Spanish because they knew I spoke Spanish, and they were interested in learning that. And I always started by telling them, you already know Spanish. They would say, oh, I don't know a word of Spanish. Yes, you do. You've crossed the Rio Colorado, Colorado the state, La Sierra Nevada. You've crossed, So I started saying all these names. You've been through San Francisco, some of you from all kinds of places in Wyoming that have Spanish names too. And all the language of the cowboys, this Mexican language. Riata, corral, rodeo, sombrero, you name it. So I started teaching them things that anybody should know in our culture. And then I said, well, you put words together this way, And so I had fun. Then that also reinforced the fact that I had teaching ability and that I knew how to relate to people's needs of different backgrounds and different levels. So that was a good experience in Yuma. But I took that experience and I was hired in Phoenix during the War on Poverty when President Johnson was there after President John Kennedy was killed in 1960. And so Phoenix, I was organized to work with youth because I had been in recreation.
What year did you get to Phoenix?
That was 1964. Because I was there from 64 to 69, and that's when I went to San Jose. But during those years, then I went and got my graduate degree in social work. Because I was told, oh, you'll never get much of any place without a professional credential. So because I was working with social workers, and the Phoenix Community Council was the agency I worked for, serving Maricopa County, which was a social planning council to bring agencies together to provide for needs of people. The Boy Scouts or the Salvation Army, or all the agencies that are nonprofits were part of the community council. So I learned something else valuable: how to work with services, how to understand needs and matching needs with services. And I had a very good teacher, Milt Gann, who was an MSW, and he had organizing from Columbia University. So he was Jewish. So he was one of these very aggressive types that says, this is what needs to happen. So when the War on Poverty came to Phoenix, he was looking for somebody to work with youth. And I interviewed for the job and he hired me. So that's how I got to Phoenix. And then I organized the Neighborhood Youth Corps. I organized the first multi-purpose services center south of the Salt River. I worked with groups that were having troubles with kids in the schools, blacks and Chicano kids. And so I learned to work with conflict. I learned to work with the establishment because the Phoenix Community Council was made up of establishment types. Monsignor Donahoe was our pastor, was part of it, but then so was Sandra Day O'Connor, and so were some other movers and shakers and I'm not sure I can remember other names, but the mayor, Milt Graham, was there. There were bankers, there were corporate types. So I learned about working with the establishment to meet the needs of the inner city sort of thing. And then the war on poverty was there, so I was responsible for bringing in funding to help. And the Neighborhood Youth Corps was all about getting high school kids to work in different settings such as libraries, recreation, counseling, and helping older people with their homes, etc. So that was a heck of a good organized experience.